name is Harold Davis. I'm here to teach you about the art and craft of digital photography.
Harold Davis is the developer of a unique technique for photographing flowers for transparency. He is the creator of Multi-RawProcessing and hand-HDR processing. He's a Moab Master and a Zeiss Ambassador. Harold is an internationally known photographer and a sought-after workshop leader, and his website is digitalfieldguide.com. Now I'm going to stop my screen share and hand it over to Harold. Hi, Harold.
Hi, Phyllis.
Greetings.
Greetings. Can everyone see me? I think the answer is yes. At least I can see me, and that's a good sign. Behind me is Lembart Dome, which is at one end of Tuolumne Meadows up in the Sierras, where I made this photograph for a beautiful sunset. And as Phyllis says, it was one of the ones where the magic of using the data in a full raw file, the full range of data in a raw file, became really apparent. So it's why I used it as the background today. I'm really excited to present this topic to you. It's a bit of a technical topic in some ways, but I'm going to present it from a pragmatic and practical viewpoint. How can you use it in your work? Whether or not you know it, you are probably using some multiple raw processing. For example, if you use Lightroom adjustments under the hood, these adjustments are taking advantage of the range in your raw files, assuming that you're photographing from raw. Before I get started, my agenda is going to be a slideshow, and then I've got prepared, time permitting, 4 different examples that show the sort of classical range of multi-raw processing. And I have to warn you that in many webinars, I cut down file size so that things don't take so long, but it's hard to do that in this particular webinar, because the very point of having a raw file is that you can't convert it to start with. So there may be a little bit of time lag in processing things. Before I do get started with the slideshow, I want to show you a couple of show and tells. We're very excited. Yesterday, FedEx from Korea showed up with the advanced copy of the new book. This is a beautiful book and kind of fat brick, so to speak, and it even has a section in it on multiple raw processing, I do think. So we're excited to have this on site. Hopefully the rest of the copies will show up at some point too. And the other show and tell I want to have relates to one of the examples. So what you can see here is a fuchsia in a little plastic holder. I photographed a flower bud that I'll show in one of the examples in this little plastic holder. This thing is a safety cover for a plug. Back when we had little kids crawling around the house, we had a number of these with a piece of tape wrapped around it. So the takeaway here is that you use what you've got and improvise with it. It turns out it makes a nice upright plant holder with some issues that we'll talk about when we get to the example on a light box. Okay. Without too much further ado, I'm going to share my screen and get started on the slideshow, unless there are any questions before I get started.
Danielle actually has a question. First, she says, "Love your shirt and wow on the photo." And
wish I were there.
And she asks, which of your books covers this process the most?
Yeah, the most coverage of it is in the Photoshop darkroom. To some extent, I cover this in all my books because I believe it is a technique and technology that cuts through digital photography across the board for serious photographers. But it's detailed in step by step in the Photoshop darkroom, and it's in both of them, but the first one covers it the way I like to through Bridge and Adobe Camera Raw into Photoshop. The second one covers it from Lightroom into Photoshop. So depending upon your workflow, you could pick the book. Both of them cover it is the short answer. I would start with number one because it's number one. Okay, here we go. So this is multi-raw processing. If you're here for, I don't know, architectural photography, you're probably at the wrong webinar. Okay, why didn't that work? Good question. Now it did. Here's the cover of the book I just showed you, and making great photos of flowers, gardens, landscapes, and the beautiful world around us. We have a discount code for each of these books. Phyllis will put them in the chat box at some point, and I've got a slide with them at the end of the presentation. The motto here, if once is nice, twice is nicer. Actually, 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 times might be nicer. You can process a raw file as many different times as you'd like. Furthermore, you can use other kinds of techniques besides raw processing combined with multi-raw processing. So there's a lot of flexibility in here. The idea of taking these into Photoshop as layers is that you can use as much of whatever processing element you want selectively over as much of the area as you want. The question is, what do the following photos have in common? And you could put the answer into the chat box if you want, but what they all have in common is that some portion of the post-production of all of these images involves multiple raw processing. And a few of them are even the case studies we'll be taking a look at as we go along. So we've had a fair range of imagery here, from lightbox work to landscapes, to close-ups of flowers, to Giverny in the spring, to a lowering sky over an old Templar fort, to the road less traveled. Famously, Ansel Adams said, the negative is the score and the print is the performance. Well, a print is still a pretty incredible performance these days, but it's less than it used to be, in the sense that once you have the profile, the parameters, and the settings down for a given image and a given piece of paper and a given printer and all this stuff, and I'm not saying that's easy, there's a true craft to it, but once you have it down, you can replicate it as many times as you like. When Adams was in the darkroom, a lot of what he did was involve a hand process with burning, dodging. He would write out documents with 100 steps on how to do it. So in some similar way, today the raw file is the score and the processed file, the post-processed file, is the performance. We're going to go back to some of the basics of layers, and the point of doing this and bringing your processing through Photoshop is that you can put each raw processed version as a layer. And this photograph here that I made of a leak at our kitchen is sort of an illustration of layers. Here's some layers in a layer stack. Okay, so basically it's a sandwich going up of layers. And I like to think of a layer stack as like a stack of pancakes. Okay, so the upper left graphic of the pancake with a pat of butter on top is, you're sitting in a diner. We used to do that, eating pancakes that looked like that, maybe. And at using a normal blending mode, looking down at your layer, only the top layer is visible in the final results. So if you want to show lower layers through, you have to do something to alter the opacity of part of the layers. That's what a layer mask is for, and for painting, and what painting on a layer mask is about. Here's another version of the layer stack, and this one is specifically intended to address the issue of processing from raw. Version 1, version 2, version 3. If you're wondering right now about the mechanics of this, you can simply open a file in Adobe Camera Raw or any other raw processors as many times as you like and tweak the settings. We're going to go through this, so don't worry, but that's looking ahead. That's the prequel. How do you get a layer stack into Photoshop? You know, Photoshop, load files from Bridge, you load files into Photoshop layers, double click it if it's set correctly. Lightroom, edit in, open as layers in Photoshop if you have multiple virtual copies selected, or you can just go edit in Photoshop with a single file. My recommendation is to set Photoshop for individual image windows, not tabbed windows. You can use copy and paste to align layers. You can also use the move tool while holding down the shift key to constrain things to exactly align layers. It's important because look at what's happening. If you're doing multiple processes of a file, you've got to get them exactly aligned, or you're going to introduce unsharpness into your image. A black layer mask conceals, it's called a hide all layer mask. And a white layer mask reveals, it's called a reveal all layer mask. Excuse me for a second, I'm about to sneeze, and we have to edit this out of the final, right, Phyllis? Give me a second. All right, that should cover that. So black conceals and white reveals, and Harold is back doing his thing. Black conceals, white reveals, important footnote, based on the layer associated with the mask. So here's an example from one of my books. I think it's from The Way of the Digital Photographer. You can see that I'm combining layers to create a finished image here that shows a really dark foreground and a somewhat light background. Same thing here with this pipe. I wanted to paint in the ribs. You can actually do a layer mask that paints in the rims like this. And again, you can be very selective about what you paint in. And I want to bring up the point that I said before, that it's not just exposure that can be modified using multi-RawProcessing, which is an interesting point. So here you go again, you're combining the sky and the earth, and you can get something that's much more striking than either alone. And here are some more examples created using multi-RawProcessing as well as other techniques. Generally in my workflow, the point that I'll start at is first of all, I usually photograph using brackets. So I have a lot of exposures to choose from. Sometimes I will combine these different bracketed exposures, and that's the subject of a webinar that I'm giving in the beginning of September on hand-HDR. So I have these bracketed exposures, and Phyllis, you might want to put up in the chat box the link to register for the hand-HDR webinar, because it's truly a related topic. Now, sometimes you can't use the brackets together, okay? There can be a bunch of different reasons for this. One of the examples I'm going to show, I'll show you why you can't use the bracketed images together. It's because my my little holder didn't fully work, and I got movement between the two, and hand alignment of bracketed copies where things are out of alignment is just not a great idea. So another reason might be that your subject is moving, okay? So when you have clouds such as these over Paris from Montmartre, you're not going to want to try too hard to create a bracketed sequence, because the clouds were moving fast enough that it produces a truly odd result in the sky if you try to do that. So you basically have probably have a single shot to work with. Maybe you can photograph one for the background and one for the top, but you're probably still going to want to use multiple raw portions to create your image. And same thing here with this image of traffic back in the days with traffic was like this over the Brooklyn Bridge in lower New York City. This is a photograph of a mysterious island in San Francisco Bay, and it was a night photograph by moonlight under clouds, a single photograph that was multiple raw processed to create the final image. As were these trees along a trail up near me in Tilden Park. And this is a complex image which was finished with a texture overlay over the top, but the base image here was a multiply raw processed image. And with this one, in Central Park, New York, near Bethesda Fountain, I wanted to make the sky portion of the image considerably more blue than the nice sort of warm tones of the underground part of the bridge there. With this sunset on the Atlas side in Morocco, I really didn't have very long to make this image. I sort of raced up there for sunset, and so I needed to process the foreground differently than the background sky. And similarly, on something like this rainbow over the Seine in Paris, you don't, and with a bird flying through it, you can't do something like this as a bracketed sequence. So the only way that you're really going to get exposure right for the foreground and the sky is to combine multiple raw instances of the same image. The Lago di Como in Italy at dawn, same thing. In the Sagrada Familia in Barcelona, the fact is that you cannot use a tripod in there. And so ideally, I would have liked to have done a bracketed sequence looking up, but that couldn't happen. So I took a fairly extreme wide angle lens and just handheld it up at the ceiling. But obviously the dark part in the cloisters is going to be way too dark if you expose properly for the sky. So one thing we have to talk about is how to expose if you know you're going to be doing multiple raw processing. That becomes an important issue. And similarly with this image in Florence along the river, the point here also is that this image with the sky that was processed also has a texture overlay on it. And similarly, sunrise at Courts-sur-Ciel in France and so on. I'm so happy to be able to access the various different exposure and white balance and color potentialities within my entire raw files that it makes my life complete. These are the discount codes for the books, and Phyllis will probably put this slide up toward the end, but it also shows how to get hold of me and various other my feeds and so on. Okay, so here we have a raw file. Let me look at it bigger. View full screen preview. Okay. Now, the first thing that I should note is that you cannot actually display an actual raw file. A raw file is meaningless, you know? It's a matrix of data in like about 20 different dimensions and we'll look at how you access those dimensions easily in Photoshop in a minute. But a raw file itself is meaningless. What you get when you look at a raw file using Bridge or Lightroom or your tool of choice is a simulation. Okay, so this basically is a simulated JPEG file that was created from a raw file for the sole purpose of showing you on your computer, or me on my computer, what the raw file kind of looks like or might look like if you processed it in exactly this way. Keep in mind also that when you set your camera to produce a JPEG, or if you set it, as I often recommend, to create both JPEGs and RAW files, that the camera itself has an engine that processes from the RAW to a JPEG, and those engines have been actually getting a lot better in recent years. Okay, so let us double click this raw file. This is a NEF file, which is the raw file that Nikon mirrored DSLRs produce. And that should open it in Adobe Camera Raw, which is a plug-in to Photoshop, technically speaking. So take a good look at the raw window here, at the ACR raw window here, because I live a lot of my life in this window. There are a couple of, first of all, okay, I almost don't know where to start, first of all. There's so much fun stuff here. Before I do anything else, look at this image itself. I was walking a couple of weeks ago on the new walkway across the Richmond San Rafael Bridge, which basically completes the round the bay trail. So it's about 200 miles, and you can walk around San Francisco Bay, and I think you can do most of it in a socially distanced way. There certainly weren't very many other people on this walkway on the fine afternoon that I walked across it. Be that as it may, I've got the question of how you expose for both the dark shadows under the fence and the bright lights on the fence, and the answer is you don't. So a couple of the crucial sliders here, I'll just talk about two of them for the moment. One of them is exposure. So I can bump my exposure up. This is plus 3.25 EV. This is plus 5 EV. By any standards, the image is overexposed when you go to plus 5 EV. And by any standards, it's underexposed to the point of being black at minus 5 EV. So this is perhaps the crucial fact of multi-raw processing, that you've got 10 EV, minus 5 to plus 5 EV range within a single raw file. I almost have to repeat that. You have 10 EV range within a single raw file. Consider that each EV is half, or depending how you look at it, twice the previous one. So to do a little bit of tedious math, you've got 2 to the 10th range of exposure values within a single raw file. 2 to the 10th is 1024. So there's 1,000 times from darkest to lightest exposure values included in the data in every single raw file. 1,000 times from lightest to darkest in every single raw file. Isn't that just the most awesome thing you've ever heard? It should give you shivers and goosebumps. Now, fairness. Not all of this is usable. I'm sitting here looking and making you look at a black screen. You can't do much with a black screen. So a very valid question is, as I ramp up the slider going into positive territory here, how much of this range is actually usable? Well, that depends. Depends on a lot of things. Perhaps significantly, it depends on the hardware you're using, your camera. cameras have got a lot better at handling a range of exposures than they used to be a decade ago. It depends on your tolerance for noise. It depends on various other things, but it's a great question. And trial and error is what you're going to have to do. But it's fair to say that you probably have a usable range of -2 to +2 within most raw files, and that's still quite a huge range. The other question is what are the implications here for how I should expose to get the maximum range in my file, maximum dynamic range in my single raw file? The canonical wisdom is you have two different limits here. The canonical wisdom is you want to aim at the brighter side of the histogram because you got more data when it's lighter. And there's some truth to that. On the other hand, you cannot recover using multi-raw or other techniques from something that's blown out. So you need, if you know you're going to be processing via multi-raw, you have to be sure to you have to be sure to not allow things to blow out unless you're willing to have the blown out areas be completely white, because once it's blown out, you're toast. Okay, so let me just point out a couple more things about this dialogue. We can revisit it later on, and then let me show this in simple action, because the action is where it's at. Simple thing number one, not only can you do exposure, but you also have contrast, various other things going down here, and you can change these on a per raw process basis. White balance is probably the single most significant. In this image, it doesn't matter less, because probably this is processed to black and white anyhow. So you really don't care about white balance here. But in a color image, it matters a lot. Remember that image I showed you of Central Park, where I wanted the white balance on the sky to be very different than the Bethesda fountain architecture at the bottom. Okay, so note there are other sliders here. Okay, note also this hidden drop-down dialog within the Adobe Camera Raw window. There are some pretty useful things in here. The previous conversion one, if you're doing multi-raw, is really important because it lets you start at the same place. You can also set it to Camera Raw defaults, which sets it back to the way it should be. And you can also export settings. You can save the settings in a file and then load them back in if you've got a lot of images to process. So there are a lot of things here that are shortcuts. Also note, I would be negligent if I didn't point out the workflow options dialog, which is unfortunately kind of hidden down here in the link you'll see at the bottom. The rule about gamut and bit depth is that once it's lost, you can't really get it back. The implication of that is you want to stay as high in gamut, color width, and bit depth as you can for as long as possible. So normally I set my color space to ProPhoto RGB, which is the widest RGB, and to 16 bits per channel. So, and I don't resize my image to bring it in. I want to leave it at my default, which with the Nikon D850 is 45 megapixels, about the same on the Z7 and less on some of the other Nikon cameras. Once you set that once, you really don't have to reset it, but the default out from the factory is not going to be the way you want it, so you should take a look at it. Okay, so my strategy for processing this image is I'm going to leave it alone for the left-hand side for the shadow, and I'm going to lighten the heck out of the right-hand side for the for the shadow area, and I'm going to use a layer mask and a gradient in between the two versions. So here, let's go. I hold down the Alt key and I click Open Copy to open it up into Photoshop. See, I'm going to make this window a little bigger. Fine. Now I go back into Bridge and I'm going to open it a second time. Here's where the magic happens. I'm going to open it a second time in Camera Raw, and this time I'm going to pull the exposure dial way over. I'm going to go plus 3. Interesting things that can happen when you do this. I mean, because you see things. I mean, I'm not doing this very carefully, and maybe I'm exaggerating the impact. Incidentally, the Alt key, the open copy thing, doesn't matter all that much. It's really not going to overwrite a raw file no matter what you do. I do recall one raw image that I opened up, and it showed under a dark porch somewhere. There was actually somebody sleeping, which I had no idea that person was there. Okay, so here you have on the right side a raw processed version of this image, default as it came out of the factory box right here. And here you have one that's roughly speaking plus 3 EVs or 8 times brighter. The way that works again is 2 to the 3rd power, which is 8. Okay, so it's on this logarithmic scale of values. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to copy the lighter one over the darker one. So one way to do that is to select all in the source image, to go Edit, Copy. Bear in mind there are keyboard shortcuts for all these things, but I like to show the menu items because you can't really see me doing keyboard stuff. You go on the target and you go Edit, Paste. Okay, now I'm going to, without even saving it, I'm going to close the lighter version. And on my layered document here, first of all, I'm going to label what each thing is. This one is the default. And this one is lighter plus 3 EV, okay? And you know, you don't have to label it, but I recommend you do, because particularly if you get something that's complex with a lot of pieces, that helps understand what we're doing. So layer mask, hide all. I put a black layer mask over the lighter area. And now I'm going to go to my gradient tool over here on the tool panel. I'm going to make sure that the foreground color is white and the background color is black. It's a very simple gradient. And I'm just going to draw it something like that. Okay, before I let go, you should take a look at it. Okay, and like magic, up comes the part of this image that was in shadows. What I'm not entirely happy with here is that this area, the lower black, is still in shadow. So I can take my brush tool and I can put my opacity at, well, let's set to 83% right now. Let's keep it there and see how that goes. I need a nice big brush for this. And I just paint in whatever I want. Okay, so this is kind of a classical example of simple multi-raw processing. And before I go any further with this, I would like to make sure that everybody is clear about it. I don't see any questions, at least addressed in the chat box. I haven't opened the panelist chat box. Phyllis, is there anything that I should answer? And anybody, if you want to put a question in, please put it in, and I'm happy to try to answer it. This is what you really need to understand before you go much further with a multi-raw processing.
There's a question actually about Lightroom.
Okay.
Richard would like to know, can multi-raw be accomplished successfully in Lightroom by processing the same image differently and then using merge to HDR to combine the differently processed versions?
I wouldn't use merge to HDR. Sort of, yes. I mean, for this kind of classical hand multi-raw processing, you're better off if you start in Lightroom, do 2 different versions, and then do edit in Photoshop, or edit as layers in Photoshop is fine. That'll align them, and then you can do layers. Yeah, HDR programs, I mean, theoretically, after all, you could, even leaving Lightroom out of it, you could do 4 different versions and, you know, 1 EV apart here in ACR, and save them in Photoshop as PSDs or TIFFs, and then use whatever HDR program you like to convert them. That does not seem to work as well as yeah, as merging them by hand. But, you know, experiment. If you get something you like, more power to you. The problem is that the HDR programs themselves like to use the data in the raw file, so you're kind of trying to use the same data in 2 different ways.
Deborah would like to know, what does the gradient do, and how do you know where to place it?
Well,
Well, the gradients was drawn on the layer mask, not on the layer itself. And you can see that
but
in the
yeah.
layer panel.
I'll back up for a second and do it again. But before I do that, what the gradient does is it provides a blend from black to white, or more accurately, from the foreground color to the background color, which is why I emphasize checking what your foreground color is and your background color isn't. Since I am drawing on a layer mask, which is grayscale, black to white, what's going to happen is it's going to change the layer mask. So let's back up to, first of all, to where I drew the gradient here, and then let's look at the layer mask. Okay. So Deborah, see how the layer mask itself is white at the top. That part of it's going to be revealed. See how it's black at the bottom. That part of it's going to be hidden. And see how there's a blend in between. That's what the gradient tool really does. The blend makes it, the mixture, look normal instead of this hard line cutoff. By using a gradient, you're not doing a hard line cutoff. I could have had the same effect by having a brush starting out at 100%, going to 0 at the bottom, and sort of hand doing it in at 50% in between. And you want to draw it starting a little, both starting and going a little beyond the areas you want to change. So, you know, in some images, drawing in the gradient isn't that critical, and this was one of them, because it's so obvious here where what you oops, here, let me just yeah, it's so obvious here what you want to do. You want to get the whole right diagonal side open and the other closed. So you could kind of draw it in almost anywhere, really, and get fairly good results, and modify to suit. For example, here, I'm just going to draw it in this way. And I remember I said you start a little beyond. So everything above where I start drawing is going to go white, and everything below it is going to go black. Okay. So I'm going a little beyond. See, so, you know, experiment with it. Some of this is, you know, living by doing and experimenting, but it's not rocket science either. In some ways, drawing the gradient is really pretty easy. Do note, I think, as Phyllis was saying, that you have to draw it on the layer mask, not on the layer. So that means that the little thumbnail of the layer mask has to be selected in the layers panel. If you try to draw it on the layer over here, you're going to be turned into toast. Toast being a term of art for people who try to use Photoshop and then get frustrated and tear whatever hair they have left out. So this is one of the things I get emails about. Make sure you're working on the layer mask, not on the layer. Deborah, does that clear it up more or less?
She says, thank you. This is the first time I understood this.
Yay. Let me just, for the heck of it, say that first of all, I decided that what I did here was too much. someday, Harold, you'll go too far. So,
And of course, there are other questions going along with all this.
oh, well, are they timely? Should I do that before I show a little bit of a fill-up on this thing?
Sure. One is, could you just repeat the copy and paste?
Let me get to that on each example is going to have that. I'll repeat that on other examples, but the short version is starting with let's define source and target. Target is what's going to be beneath. Source is what you want to put on top of it. With the source, you go select all, edit, copy. Then you move to select the target and you go edit, paste. Really pretty simple. And I will also show the move tool method of doing the same thing. I've got 4 examples prepared. I'm not sure if we're going to get through all of them, but if we do, I will show it on each and every one of them.
And let's see, Steve would like to know, why are you using an older version of Photoshop?
Because I'm a closet Luddite.
No.
The thing is that I've got a fairly old Mac laptop, a PowerBook, and I just, for the life of me, every time I go into creative whatever and try to upgrade it, it screws the whole thing up. So at some point I just give up on it. I don't, there's nothing I use in the new features that particularly in the newer Photoshop that particularly matters to me. So as far as I'm concerned, I wish they would fix the old features and stop trying to upgrade everything. But I don't think it makes any difference. How about that? Okay, so I'm gonna for the heck of it, just because playing around with Camera Raw is how I spend my spare time. I'm going to put my opacity on the layer that lighten the shadows down and say, I'm going to put it down to 75%. And I think at some respects it is, I'll put it down further to make the point. I'll put it down to 50%. And let's say what I want to do here is, I don't know what this detail over here is, but I don't really want to see it. So I'm going to put my foreground color to black. I'm going to take the brush tool and I'm going to take it to about 300 pixels, and I'm going to paint this stuff out. I don't want it so prominent here. So I'm going to, okay, that's ugly, but you get the idea. And so I can use my brush tool on the layer mask to paint out areas that I don't want to show. And then what I can also do is I can go back in, I don't care about exporting the clip box. I can go back into Camera Raw and I can go to where I was last time, previous conversion. And instead of being plus 3.1 EV, I can go down and well, it could be minus, I could really be plus. Let's say I'm plus 5 EV here and open it up. I think I opened it. Where is it? What I'm going to do with this is I'm going to paint in the lines of where the light was reflecting off the railing there. See, now this is plus 5 EV. You would never want to use this in its entirety, but using it as a part isn't bad. Oh, I saw some comment go by that people can't read the questions. I think some questions came directly to Phyllis as a panelist, so that would be the issue. Layer mask, hide all. And now I've got my plus 5 EV. I put my foreground color to white. I have my brush here. I can take the opacity of that brush down if I don't want to be too shocking, and I can say paint in these lines. Now in real life, you would need to be a lot more careful to make that look halfway decent, but real life is what it's all about. Okay, any questions about this? Shall I move on to the next example? I'm going to take that as an affirmative thumbs up. All right, so let's go to the aster. So my not so brilliant concept was that with this image was that I was going to photograph it on a light box doing this thing, using this thing. And you have it here at 6 seconds, nice and bright, 3 seconds. And as I start to go down the exposure tree, 1.6 seconds, 0.8 seconds, 0.4 seconds, and 0.2 seconds. You'll see that the device underneath begins to show, but it obviously wouldn't be that hard to get rid of it once I combine the layers. So one of the first things I did is run it through an automated HDR program. And I won't bore you with sitting while the computer does that, but if you take a look at the results in, let's say, Aurora here, you can see that there's an alignment issue, right? That's what the blurring means. So something moved. Maybe there was wind in the room where I was doing it. Maybe my little device didn't quite hold the flower. Something moved. Okay. If I was just going to use automated HDR, here it is in Nik HDR, which actually did a better job on it, but there's misalignment too, particularly in the area down here. You can, if you look closely, you can actually see it pretty well. There, that shows it. You can check the alignment box in or option in any of the HDR programs, and that's usually going to do a fairly good job of aligning it. But once you do that, you can't add other aspects. It's not, it resizes it to make it align it. So in terms of my workflow, that's not really an option. So what I pretty quickly realized was that I was not going to be able to use hand HDR or on this image before I go and show what I actually did. Here's the way the image turned out. What I decided to do was to start with this version, and it struck me as the closest to what I really wanted to end up with, which, you know, if you do a bracketed sequence, is what you should look for, is the closest. So here I am opening that. What I next did after with it opened was my strategy here was to say, okay, the petals look pretty good in this version, but I'm going to need to both brighten up and change the color value on the center of the flower to make this the kind of image that I want to make it. What I first did here, though, was I painted out the base of the what is it, the electric plug protector. So I'm not gonna do it in great detail, but and it's not really a multi-raw issue, but usually with these kinds of images, you get all kinds of nutty things that you have to do to make it come out right and first. So, you know, you know, you just sort of, and you have to be a little more careful in this in real life, but
you're obviously working hard there, because I see you nicking petals and stuff, and you would you would never do that.
No, never. And you wouldn't let me get away with it if I
No
did.
way.
Okay, so there we go. We've got nicked petals and stuff, and we're going to ignore that. So I go back to the same image, and I open it a second time in Adobe Camera Raw. And this time I'm only worrying about the center of this image. So I want to make it lighter. B, I want to increase the contrast. And most important perhaps, I want to make it more yellow, and I also going down to my other sliders. Let's add some saturation in there, so a little vibrance, a little clarity. And so this is all about the center here. Okay, nice center. Actually, perhaps this is even better than the other version, but such is life. No, the truth is I'm doing this in real time. And yes, I've processed this image, so I have an idea where I'm going. But if you go with the idea that the raw file is the score and the processing is the performance, every performance is going to be different, right? Here, let me show the Move Tool version of copying with alignment. And that is, I've selected the source. I hold down the Shift key. I use the Move Tool over the target. I let go of the mouse and I let go of the Shift key. Okay, this would be plus, I think it was about 1 EV, and plus saturation, white balance, etc. Okay, I'm going to shut this version down. Don't save. Layer mask, hide all. I need to get my brush size right. I'm holding down the Alt and the Option keys, which allow me to size the brush tool by dragging it. It's a cool trick. And let's see, probably 100% is too much. Let's make the flow 50%, which gives me better control. And maybe I'll put opacity. I'll see how 50% goes, and I'll make it a bit harder. Okay, so there you go. So let me zoom in on that area. Okay, so everybody see that? Any questions about this example?
Harold, would you show the layer mask, how it's just got the dot in the middle? I kind of see it there.
Sure.
So that's where the center of the flower is. It's showing through.
Exactly.
On that layer. And then all the rest on that extra bright layer is hidden.
Correct.
I like how it has the fluffy edge too, so that it's, so it's got a little bit of a gradient there from the brush, so there's no hard edge.
That's right. If I were doing something like glassware, which I've been photographing on a light box during the pandemic, I would probably want my brush to be really hard so the edges are totally defined. Here, as Phyllis says, you want it fluffy. So I had the brush tool set, I think, to about 20% hardness, which 18%. Often, I'd say the majority of the time I use a very soft brush, somewhere between 2 and 8%. Which is basically almost entirely soft. The softer the brush, the more fluffy the edge is going to be. Okay. Here's the simulation of this sunset view from Dead Horse Point in the Island in the Sky area of Canyonlands near Moab, photographed. Who knew that this was my last ride for freedom back in February? Seems like a different world. Anyhow, they're looking at this. They're to make a final image, and here was the final that I actually did. Okay, it's a much more civilized image than the place I started. There really are two things I want to look at going in opposite directions. Number one, I need a little more color in the sky. Okay, I'm not really interested in trying to make this into a sort of vibrant nightmare sunset sky. I could do that. I can do just about anything using multi-RawProcessing, but I needed to make the sky a little more interesting. And I definitely need to up the exposure here. So two very different issues. Remember, here's the raw file. Okay, so what we're going to do, we're going to create a slightly darker but more saturated version for the sky and put that in using a gradient and layer mask. And we're going to produce a lighter area for down here, which we're primarily going to put in with a gradient, but we're probably also going to have to do some brushing, both to make sure we don't go over this nice sunset color here, and also there may be areas that the gradient doesn't touch. Strategy makes sense to everybody? Okay, I'll say yes at once, please. So weird teaching online, you know. If you're in a classroom and you say something like that and you look at people and they say, oh yeah, we understand, or you can just look at people's body language and you know whether they do or not. But here I've sort of got to try to figure it out for myself. Okay, so let's do a first pass here. Let's just leave this alone and open it up. This one's called Leave It Alone. And let's make this a little smaller so we can see things a bit better. And let's go back and do one for the sky next. And I want to point out that by showing this as my third example, I've done 3 very common scenarios and a huge range, okay? There's really nothing this technique doesn't touch. You know, I started with a situation where there were strong dark shadows and strong brights. Okay, so we pretty easily handled that. The second one dealt with an issue of a light box photograph of a flower where the center of the flower wasn't correctly exposed, but everything else was. This one is a pretty common landscape where you have a dark foreground and a light sky. The only thing that's a little bit different here is that you've got this beautiful golden hour sunset color over here, and you wouldn't want to overwrite that. But otherwise, this is a common scenario that every landscape photographer faces almost every time they go out there. Galen Rowell, the famous climbing photographer, once said that the only time worth photographing is at sunset, and there are only so many sunsets in the life of every landscape photographer, and one ought to be out with one's camera for each and every one of them. I'm not quite going to go that far, but yeah, you know, so okay. So let's, for the sky, let's first of all make it a little darker. This is just the sky, that strip at the top we're worrying about. So I'm going to go -1 EV, and I'm going to bump the color temperature up, make it warmer. I'm going to go up, and I'm going to bump the tint, and I'm also going to go find saturation and vibrance and bump them up a bit too. And about like that. So now we have a nice sunset color in the sky. Opening it up. In the due fullness of time, it too shall open in Photoshop. Here we go.
Oh, and Harold, a question that's definitely related to this. Lorraine asks, how do you choose a gradient? How do you decide which one?
Well, basically, to begin with, what I would say is that, you know, okay, so look, in here in the gradient panel, basically you want the defaults is the short answer. There's nothing very fancy with the gradients going on here. If you look at this, for the first two are basically number 1 and number 3 are white to black and black to white, and that's really what you want one or the other. And the question of which one you want depends what is the foreground color and what is the background color, but just choose the first one. So there's nothing really fancy here, at least at this point in doing this. But good question. So I'm going to use the move tool method this time. I select the move tool in the tools panel, select the source image, hold down the shift key, drag the image over the target, let go of the mouse, let go of the shift key. Okay. Next time I'll use the other method again. Sky, shutting down this darker one, closing this, layer, layer mask, hide all, and I'm going to start. Remember I said start a little higher than you want, go down a little more. This is going to be a pretty steep mask because I don't want to get the darker saturated color too much into that beautiful part of the landscape there. So something like that. Everybody see that? Don't say yes all at once, but I certainly saw it. Let me take it off for a second. Okay, there's the sky. And let me just show the layer mask. That's what the layer mask looks like. Now, this performance was a little bit on the wobbly side, so I didn't do a straight line, and it probably should have been a straight line across from where the earth meets the sky. You see how I deviated a little from that. I'm not going to try to fix that right now, but there you go. That it actually looks okay in the results here. Let's go back to the raw file, and we'll pull up a lighter version for the landscape. What I'm going to do this time is I'm going to keep the settings that I did for the sky, but just lighten everything up immensely. So I'm going to use previous conversion to get back to those settings, which adds some saturation and stuff in. And I'm going to overdo it a little. So I'm plus 2.4 EVs here. Okay. Yeah, remember with the gradients, since you're doing it on the layer mask, not the layer, you're operating in grayscale. So the question really is, what's the blend going to be? It's the colors in it don't matter. Okay, so here we have a light landscape version. And if I can find my cursor again, here we are. This time I'm going to do select all, edit, copy, edit, paste. Okay, and now we have the landscape version in front. I'm going to close down the other. But this is a three versions of the raw file here. Leave it alone, sky, and this is earth. What am I going to do next, everyone?
Could it be add a hide all layer mask?
Ah, thank you, everyone. Thank you, class. Layer mask, hide all. Now let's try a gradient here. A gradient isn't going to get us all the way on this one, but it'll give us a start. So I'm going to draw it this way, like that. Okay. Now that did some of my stuff, but it didn't do all of it, and it overdid some stuff too. I'm not so worried about the overall overdo, but I want to get back the parts that are too bright, so I'm going to use a brush tool for that. I'm going to, so I just hit up here with a black brush, and I'm going to hit like that with the white brush, so I don't want it touching my beautiful golden hour colors, and I need to get a little bit more into here too. And overall, my painting in of the earth light layer is too much. You don't really want it that bright probably, so you can take down the opacity of the overall layer. And you know, the how and where you do this on your image is your aesthetic choice. You know, in the real world, I would take more care than I did in this fast example. I always hate working in front of crowds of people, but it's what you got to do when you do this. And you know, there's no right and there's no wrong in essence with these things. The point is that the post-production from a raw profile is the performance, and you can look at things and say, okay, maybe I wanted it a little lighter here, in which case you hit it up with the light layer and make it a little lighter there. So any questions about this example?
Not at the moment. Harold, I was wondering, could you hide the top two layers and just work the way up so you can see what you've done?
Great idea. Okay, so this was the default conversion from the raw file. It's presumably pretty much what the JPEG your camera would generate would look like. So that's an interesting point. If you don't do some form of multi-raw processing, this is what you're going to get. Okay, this is not a professional result. Okay, that's darkening the sky, darkening and importantly saturating the sky. Maybe too far, by the way, in which case, if it is too far, you look at it and you say, okay, I like my sky better like that. Thank you very much. That's at 73% opacity for the overall layer. Now here's the Earth. So I started with a gradient. I made sure that to extend the gradient up here, I painted out this stuff up here so that the sky wasn't too bright. I did some stuff here, and then I said overall it's too much. I put it down to 65%. At 100%, I'm not sure whether you can see it on your screens, but here when I put it at 100%, it's definitely too bright on the land, and there you have it. Before I shut this one down, let me also show the actual version I did, just by way of comparison. We'll see which performance we like better. We like better. Well, not that far off. I mean, I did a few more things to it after the multi-raw processing, after all, too. Not too much. Basically, most of processing this image is multi-raw processing. Any questions about this?
Sonia would like to know, Harold, do you ever use any of the blending modes?
Yes, sometimes I do. Sure, why not, after all? Particularly in the case of landscapes with multi-raw processing, screen and multiply blending modes, depending on whether you want to go lighter or darker, are quite relevant. Also, soft light blending mode at low opacity, very low opacity, can increase apparent dynamic range and definition. So those three are important with this kind of work, particularly with landscapes.
And David has a question. When you use the gradient on the sky, it overlapped onto the horizon. Is this typical, or do you sometimes try to preserve the darkness of the horizon?
You know, that's going to vary both case by case and on one's own personal artistic aesthetic. You know, again, when I drew it here, I was drawing quickly. But remember, I said how you do want to start too soon and go too long, because the way gradients work is there are less of them at either point, and you got to be careful about too harsh a line, because that may look really unnatural. You've certainly seen these overdone HDR images where you can see the sort of I don't know quite what the right word is, a sort of stuff sticking up behind him, and you don't want to do that. You want to be careful about that. But again, you also don't want to cover up nice goodness. So sometimes what really makes sense is to go in and look at it at a closer level. I mean, there's a lot of detail in an image like this that you just don't see until you start looking at it at 100% or beyond. I'm only at 42% here, so you know, I could go in and have a close look, and let's go back to the one that I just did. When you do that, I'm still not even at 100% here. So you know, it makes sense to look at that kind of thing close up, because sometimes you can see things close up that you don't see when you're further away, and it has an impact even if it's only unconscious. Again, let me turn off the separate layers. So here's where this started. Here's adding the sky. That looks reasonably good to me. But again, it's going to be your choice. And here's adding in the earth, and that also looks reasonably good to me up close. I do always recommend looking at images at 3 different magnification levels. It's a mistake just to look at them the way they fit into your monitor, which it's sort of natural to do that, but it's a mistake. You want to look at them really up close, at least at 100%, if not much closer than that, depending on the capability of your monitor. This is about 100% here. And you also want to look at them in thumbnail size too, because that's how a lot of people are first going to decide whether they want to look at your image, as they're going to see it on that bloody program Instagram or someplace at about that size and say, that's interesting enough to look at more. So you want to be sure to do all 3 sizes before assuming that the move and correction you've made is the right thing. Any more questions, or one more example? I'm beginning to get kind of tired, Phyllis.
I guess one more example and off we go.
Okay. What we have here, if I can find it, is Gozo. We have Glendi Bay and Gozo. And here's the final image. Full screen preview. So this is more or less to what we aspire here. If you ever get a chance to visit Gozo on the Maltese archipelago, I recommend it. The Gozo is sort of the country island on the Malta side, and it was supposedly the Calypso's island where she kept Odysseus in the Odyssey, and it's quite a nice place. And this is the town and harbor at Zlendi, which is on one side of the island. Okay. All right. So here's the raw file. And once again, you're going to want to do a couple of things to this. You're going to want to pull up the front, which is obviously dark, and you're going to want to saturate the sky. So let's open the way it was. And I picked this image as a demo because the horizon line is fairly I won't say harsh, but it's very defined. So you can see where you have to break on it. And again, this is what the JPEG you're going to generate would probably look like. So the way things were. Is that a movie title or something? Okay. Yeah, I'd say the horizon is a little crooked too, or the line is defined, but it's sloping is what it is a little bit, but I'm not going to try to fix that now. Okay, so let me open one for the foreground, and mostly I'll pull up exposure, pull up shadows, pull up blacks, and let's overdo it a little. Okay, so that's plus, yeah, it's plus 2.5 EV. You know, you're going to have to make an aesthetic judgment about how much you want to pull things up. And you also need to keep an eye on noise, particularly when you're pulling shadows up. That's one of the places where really unattractive color noise can pretty easily be generated. That's going to depend somewhat on the camera you used. The more modern the camera, the less that's an issue, but it's still an issue to think about. So select all, edit, copy, edit, paste. And this is foreground plus 2.5 EV, roughly speaking. Close down the second raw file, layer, layer mask, hide all. And so which way do I pull in the gradient here? If I'm going from white to black, and my gradient tool is also set the same way, you can see that in the bar here. Where do I start drawing? I'll give you people a second to think about that while I take a sip of water. You can enter it in the chat box if you want. Okay, so I'm going to go from the bottom up, and I'm going to go a little past the horizon line. Since I really want the bottom of this thing to be lighter, I'm going to start about here, and I'm going to go about like that. Okay, so that lightened up the bay. It didn't really fully do it for me on the buildings on the side, so I'm going to have to whack at those with a brush tool. And let's see, we'll make that about, that like that. See how this is like magic. It's sort of like the way the darkroom was when the prints would start coming up in the developer. And, you know, again, I'm not being very careful about doing this. If I were being more careful, I would be more careful. Okay, so let me go back and do one for the sky also. The main thing I'm going to do for the sky is add saturation. I'm not going to change the exposure so much. It's a nice sky. I like it. There are a few other things in post-production I could do to make the sky more dramatic. Okay, so let's up the temperature and the tint here a little. And let's see, we can increase some contrast. We can also increase the blacks like that. And here we go. Well, I'm going to take this layer and I'm going to put it in with a gradient. And then I'm going to use the same layer again. You'll see what I'm going to do, because I like the blue in the sky. I don't want to completely remove that and make it an artificial color, but I definitely want the clouds to have more brightness. So in the due fullness of time, here it comes. I think it comes anyhow. What happened to you? Well, we'll try that again. I don't know what happened there. Okay, so we're upping the temperature, the tint, the contrast, the blacks, and the saturation, vibrance a little. And we're waiting. We're waiting. There we go. Oh, I seem to have done it twice now. How about that? Okay, well, I think I like this one better. I could do some demo with many, many, many versions, but no, we're not going to do that. So move tool, shift key, source to target, let go of the mouse. Close down the raw file, and this would be sky. Layer mask, hide all. What happened here? Oh, I somehow inadvertently did something on that. Well, let us change that.
You have an extra stroke of sunlight there, Harold.
I do. It's sort of God lighting, right?
Exactly. I think it looks beautiful.
Well, let's leave it.
There you go. You can paint it out.
That's what I'm doing. I'm painting it out. In fact, you could also, if you want to paint something like that out, you can always go to the layer mask itself and just paint on the layer mask. So. Although it's taking a little, I'm getting into some real time lag problems here, but such is life. Okay. We hit the Alt key to get back into real mode once it's finished doing it. What happened to my shaft of light? It's interesting how much of this you can really just paint in. So it's totally, so remember you want white as your foreground color if you're going to paint that way. Which direction am I going? I'm going down. I'm more or less, I really am going to start like that. I'm going to go down like that. Okay. Now, a couple of things here. Number one, I just painted over part of the buildings I don't want to paint over. So we're going to put black as the foreground color. We're going to put that down like that. We're going to put the opacity at 100%. We're going to undo what we goofed there and over here as well. Now, I went a little further than I like with the blue sky. As I said, I like the blue sky. So let me put this opacity of this layer down to about 50%. And now I'm going to copy the layer, duplicate layer. So this is a copy of the sky. And I'm going to take my layer mask off. Layer mask, delete layer mask. And I'm going to put a whole new layer mask on. I just want to paint it. Well, before I do that, let me change the blending mode of this layer into color. And I'm going to put a layer mask on top, hide all. I'm going to put it back up to 100% for the layer. And I'm just going to paint in some color in selective portions of it without impacting the beautiful blue in the sky. Okay, there we go. So let me just zoom in on that portion of it once I get control of this thing again. And here we are. So foreground, which is not all that relevant here, and the sky with more saturation, and then the particular areas of the sky that I painted in using the color blending mode so as not to impact on the rest of the blue. Questions about this?
Okay, let's see. David would like to know, oh no, here, Robert would like to know, do you use smart objects when employing this process, pros and cons?
I personally do not. The pros are that you get to see what you're doing and use what you've done as a base for others and change the settings. By duplicating your smart object, you can pretty much replicate what I've done. The con is that it is resource consumptive, and you could see already doing this on this setup that I'm pressing the limits of what I have the patience for in terms of waiting for draw time and things like that. And I find that gets really worse with smart objects. Otherwise, if resources weren't an issue and everything acted instantly, sure, one would use them.
And Danielle would like to know, do you ever use different versions of a multi-bracketed series to pull out the darks from the lighter version and lights from the darker versions to minimize noise? Would this be a less noisy end product rather than taking one raw exposure from doing all the multiple raw layers from the single exposure?
Answer is yes and yes. Certainly, if I have a bracketed range, I'm probably not going to do multi-raw much. on the whole thing. And yes, that would be preferential. You're likely to get less noise that way. Good question. Hold on one second. Let me just stop sharing my screen. There I am. You can see Lembert Dome behind me. And thank you very much for coming. I enjoy multi-raw processing greatly. It's been added for the last, I don't know, 15 years to my photographic process. Like anything, like any technique, you can overdo it. And sometimes the version right out of the camera is the best way to go. It's almost always true that if you can do something in camera, it's better than doing it afterwards. Apart from anything else, because I can be a lazy person like anybody else, and it takes less time and trouble. But I hope I've opened your eyes to a whole new way of looking at processing. And please do think of the whole post-production process as something akin to what darkroom work used to be, namely very truly a performance. It's very seldom, sometimes I've come back and reprocessed images that I did a long time ago. It's very seldom that they really come out exactly the same. Thank you very much, everybody. I enjoyed preparing for this presentation, and I've enjoyed sharing my thoughts with you. Bye.
I hope you enjoyed this video and found it informative. Be creative and stay mighty.